and welcome back to the MILELE readings. I'm glad you're here again. We are going to be reading chapter 28. Let's recap chapter 27, where Nathan and Faith are on the island of Sicily. He thinks about how they had been roughing it because of being fugitives, but now they're actually at this last stop at a grand house that is hosted by a wealthy family. Here, Nathan reveals his love to Faith, his love for her, and she declares the relationship impossible because of her role and because he is to return to Eden too. And of course, he's not having any of it, so they're still at odds. um, Also, we get a glimpse of Nathan's early relationship with Keiko, how Keiko had been proud to have the star graduate be his assistant from a renowned law firm, and how Nathan had a sort of hero worship for Keiko at first. Then Mendax Nabian came and everything changed. Now, on Eden 2, Gabriel had a tour with Agent Mike um, and Gideon, and it was revealed that Gabriel and Agent Mike are bright ones, as well as that the Eden 2 DNA could be equated with the essence of the sovereigns. Also, the Watcher revealed his master's feelings that he had been cheated, that he should be the son and have whatever Prince Adani has and will have. And so there's a huge, huge, huge grudge going on. Also, while Gabriel was on the island and Gideon was escorting him and Agent Mike, the words bridge, four corners of the earth, and beginning of the end kept coming up in conversation. So those are interesting words that we'll understand more as we go. Hope also was questioning Agios as to why he didn't just heal her. Why did he let her suffer so long? Why did he send Raphael? Does she remind you of some of us? Anyway, Agios, of course, reminded her how suffering actually accomplishes much in humans, and also reminded her of her role as the bride representing the loyals, and that she was to remember that she needed to continue to declare his truth. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for 27. So let's move on to chapter 28. And we are on the island of Sicily. And remember, Faith had told Nathan that he was now allowed to leave the house for a bit, but of course under the cover of darkness. Nathan and Faith had been walking under the cloak of darkness for a while. They were about 10 minutes outside of their host's seaside home and were approaching a small town crisscrossed with a myriad of narrow, winding streets. The air was still and warm. It seemed peaceful, but Nathan still felt just as uneasy as when they first left the house. He chalked it up to it being his first venture out since they'd arrived just over a week ago. Just at the edge of town, Faith switched off their lantern flashlight. Nathan looked behind, noticing their security shadow, a stocky man codenamed Mr. D. He breathed a little easier. Speaking of breathing, he'd become fairly adjusted to living under the mist in their temporary haven. Under the mist, even the smoke emissions and possibility of eruptions from the local volcanic mountain, Etna, had been forgotten. The cobbled roadway was empty. Most vehicles failed to function under the mist. Those that did had been altered and were owned either by government officials or the very wealthy or underground criminals. It was as if time had reversed. Now bicycles and animals, especially donkeys, were the main forms of transportation. Sparse lighting on the roadways also discouraged evening strolls, and underground criminal activity further deterred the average citizen from venturing out. Curfews existed, but most people adhered to self imposed ones for survival's sake. Night patrol was routinely done by local security, while the Council of Nations forces mostly dealt with international matters. An urgent message came today, Faith said. What? The first satellite signal has been reconnected. Nathan stopped. What? Faith continued several more steps, then paused and looked back at him. As he continued toward her, she glanced about furtively, as she'd been doing all along. It means if one transmits, it's only a matter of time before others connect again. The mist has cleared that much? Nathan asked. Have you not noticed? Faith peered through the dimness at him. Even now, what used to be like heavy clouds, even in artificial light, is now like a moderately foggy night. She was right. The mist was thinning. But after leaving Israel, Nathan had become used to relying more on sounds and smells than on sight. He looked around more intentionally. Then, as Faith moved ahead of him, he noticed something for the first time. There was a small bulge at her back, hip level, under her shirt. You haven't experienced as much time under the mist as most of the world, Faith continued. So perhaps you haven't noticed the change. She smiled. Nathan returned the smile, feeling less anxious, even knowing the reason she packed a gun. He was just happy to be with her, out for a stroll. Like a date. His thoughts had turned into words before he could stop them. What? Faith asked. Nothing, Nathan said, grinning. Faith started walking again. You shouldn't be so happy. It's bad news for us. The internet working, the mist clearing, could mean harder work for the underground Israeli loyals. He walked companionably beside her. Her words failed to dampen his joy, but he attempted to hide it. I see what you mean, he answered dutifully. I'm still waiting for the go-ahead, but we need to get you off this island soon, especially before security tightens across the world again, as inevitably it will with so many displaced people. He was partially listening to her and partially thinking about how to go about holding her hand when loud sounds suddenly echoed through the stillness of the night. They froze. Men were shouting. What the? Before Nathan could finish his sentence, another sound erupted. Gunshots? Nathan grabbed Faith's arm, tugging her backwards. Shouldn't we? He looked back the way they'd come, then looked ahead, uncertain. Wait, Faith said. Her voice was hushed and her breathing hard. Then came the distressed wail of a child. A woman screamed. Nathan turned in the direction of the cries, heart thumping. The child's cry echoed again, and before he knew what he was doing, Nathan started running and shouted, Let's go! Knowing Faith and Mr. D would follow. After running a short distance, Nathan stopped where the corner of a building jutted almost into the street. Around the corner to his right was a narrow, dead-end road with a crowded row of shops on either side. Another building was spread across the top of the road where the road ended. The disturbance was there. A street light, aided by weak glows from the building's ground floor windows, shone like beams through fog onto a canopied vehicle. The vehicle was the size of a standard cube van and was parked in front of the building. Several figures were moving about. The neighboring windows were either fully shut or with slits of light from those brave or foolish enough to peek out. Faith pushed past Nathan while speaking to Mr. D. "I'd like to help them," she said. "It might be Eden Two Blood child abduction." She quickly bent over to stash the lantern flashlight in a ground level crevice at the side of the jutted out building. She straightened, looking at Mr. D. Mr. D hesitated. "It could be dangerous," he said in a low voice. He looked pointedly in Nathan's direction. Faith looked at Nathan, pleading with her eyes. "I don't want to risk your safety. Go back with him." "Ludicrous." "You're kidding, right?" he said. "You expect us to leave you here?" Multiple voices were now raised along with the child's cry. Excuse me. Without thinking, Nathan shoved away from them and darted around the side of the jutted out building, ignoring Faith's hushed call. Staying close to the row of buildings on his right, he started a light jog. He stopped about 5 meters away from the scene, breathing rapidly, heart thumping. Faith and Mr. D rushed up beside him. A woman was being shoved to the ground by a large man. She landed almost on top of the prostrate form of another man. The large man stood above them with a shotgun in hand. A third man was hurrying toward the side door of the vehicle, holding a struggling, screaming child under one arm. "Stay put!" the large man with the gun growled at the woman, "unless you want to end up like him." "Please, please don't take my baby," the woman cried in Italian. "She's my only child, please." Crawling on her hands and knees, with her long skirt impeding her desperate movements, the woman continued to plead. "Stay out of sight," Faith told Nathan. She moved out into the road, gun in hand, with Mr. D following. As they cautiously approached the scene, Nathan followed, staying a few paces behind. No way was he letting them deal with this alone, especially with Faith involved. "Drop the gun!" Faith shouted. "Now!" Shock registered on the large man's face. His partner with the child froze. Suddenly, the driver's door of the van opened, letting another man out. He swiftly stepped in front of the man with the child and raised a rifle. "You're not official patrol," he announced, grinning maliciously. "This doesn't concern you. Go about your business." He'd spoken in Italian, but with a foreign accent. "Can you deal with him?" Faith asked Mr. D, nodding toward the man with the rifle. "No problem," Mr. D responded. "Nathan," Faith called, as if she had eyes in the back of her head. "Get down." Before her instructions had properly registered, Mr. D threw himself to the ground, then rolled, firing multiple shots at the same time. In that instant, Faith swiftly turned around, hurled herself at Nathan, slamming into him and shoving him to the ground. Pain seared his hands and knees, where they cushioned his fall. He lay face down on the hard surface, trying to catch his breath. When he raised his head, both abductors with weapons were bending over, gasping in pain and anger. Before they could regain their stance, Mr. D rushed over to the rifleman whose weapon had fallen to the ground. Faith raced over to the man with the shotgun, knocking him down to the ground. The gun went flying. She held him face down before wrestling his arms back. Then she knelt on his back, holding his arms pinned. After much frantic struggling, Mr. D also gained control of the rifleman. He shoved him forward, pinning him to the ground. Faith's opponent was screaming in agony, still struggling to free himself. She yelled at him, "Quiet, you're going nowhere." The mother was on her feet, looking frantic. The third man, with the child still under his arm, was poised to flee. Faith looked up and yelled, "Nathan, get him!" Without much thought, Nathan instinctively reacted to his peaked adrenaline. Since the man was heading his way, He simply stood up and became a boulder, crashing into the fugitive. They both tumbled down, landing with the child cushioned between them. While Nathan and the man's ragged breathing filled the space between them, the child remained surprisingly quiet. In that split second, Nathan zeroed in on the wide eyes of the child as she stared at him. He grinned, then pulled her to himself from the man's loosened grip. "We got him," Faith said from somewhere above. The man struggled and cursed as he was dragged from Nathan and the child. Bria, Mummy is here. Come to Mummy." Nathan knew enough Italian to understand the woman's cries as she lifted the child from his arms. He sat up gingerly, unsure whether his legs were steady enough to stand. After holding the child and looking her over, the woman looked down at Nathan. Thank you for saving my baby." Her face was tear-streaked and her clothes dirt-stained, but her voice was full of gratitude. Nathan stood up, feeling shaky now that his adrenaline rush was receding. Not knowing if she would understand him, he asked, "Is she okay?" The child looked no more than 3 years old, with big, dark eyes and a mop of curly dark hair. Yes, she's fine." The mother's voice broke as she spoke hesitantly in English. She cradled the child tightly to her chest and continued to express her thanks. The man who'd been lying on the ground called to the woman. She turned away from Nathan and started sobbing. The man was standing up with one hand on his head. His hair was partially matted with blood, but he was smiling. He reached with the other arm toward the woman and the child. "Oh, my dear," the woman cried, returning to her native tongue as she stumbled over to the man. They continued words of endearment as they embraced, with the child nestled between them. Breathing a sigh of relief, Nathan looked around. All three abductors, two with gunshot wounds to their legs, were on the ground face down with hands bound behind their backs. They were still struggling and cursing, while windows and doors in the vicinity were now being cautiously opened. Nathan felt a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Faith asked. Brushing away the remaining gravel from his hands, he said, "I'm good." Mr. D came over and said in a hushed, urgent tone, "You need to get him out of here before patrol arrives. I'll take care of the scene here." Not long after, Nathan hurried with Faith through the congested part of town and headed toward the open road that led to their host property. Before long, the streetlights would end, and then they would have to rely on the lantern flashlight that Faith had hastily retrieved. As they hurried along, Faith kept hold of his hand. Ironically, it had taken an evening of danger to have his earlier desire fulfilled. Her hand felt small and warm in his. "Why do you keep smiling?" Faith asked between gasps of breath. He looked across at her, but couldn't see her very well. How could she tell he was smiling? "Am I?" he asked. He didn't know he was. He slowed, then halted, pulling her towards him. "Maybe because of this?" Nathan raised their joined hands. For a moment she stared at their hands, then at him. "I just want to make sure and get you back in one piece, smart guy," she hissed, attempting to pull her hand away. He held tightly. What to do at the end of a very eventful date, you wondered. "Nathan!" Her frantic cry confused him. Faith's eyes were wide, her look aimed over his shoulder. He quickly turned, still gripping her hand. There were 3 of them, circling around, it seemed, like buzzards ready for fresh meat. Their glowing eyes told him all he needed to know. Emissaries of the Welchis. Nathan swallowed hard. Instinctively, he placed himself in front of Faith, ironically considering she had the gun. "Triune connect," she breathed. "Guns won't work on them." But before they could even gather their thoughts or words, the emissaries were suddenly cut down, felled before their eyes. A tall man stood over them, a gleaming sword in his hand. He looked at Nathan and Faith. His eyes glowed with a different light from those on the ground, like fire, fierce and cleansing. "Oh," Faith gasped. "Go," the unexpected presence said, urgency in his tone. I needed to take a breath after that one. All right, let's calm down to a scene change. Thankfully, they're okay. A few hours and a shower later, Nathan sat at a small table in his room, eating ravenously. It was a spacious room with large arched windows and sand-colored stucco interior. A large canopied bed was the central piece of furniture, along with other pieces in the same dark wood. There was also a four-piece bathroom, which rivaled the best hotels. It was certainly not what Nathan had expected after being in crowded, stifling places while on the run. Faith had disinfected the small abrasions on his palms, then brought him homemade noodles and leftover chicken. Food had never tasted or smelled better. "I guess you really were hungry," Faith teased, looking across the table at him. She'd just finished a mug of warm goat's milk and now was sitting watching him eat. "I told you I was," Nathan answered around the food in his mouth. The meat had been well marinated and filled the room with the scent of spices and herbs. He was feeling much calmer. "Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it," Faith responded, dry humor in her tone. "Not only do our hosts use generated energy technology to grow their own produce and maintain a decent number of livestock, but they also provide for many who are less fortunate. They really aspire to be Prince Adani's hands and feet." Nathan looked down at the half-eaten drumstick in his hand, then said to Faith, "Am I eating someone's meal?" She frowned, then laughed. "I didn't say that to make you feel guilty, just educating you. I'm sure your routine trips with Envoy Bays focused more on political issues than how the common person was faring." With hands still poised over his almost empty plate, Nathan ruminated on her words for a moment. "You're right." He put the drumstick down. He was incredibly focused on convincing the world that unifying nations under one leader would make for a more fortified world, that it would be more practical following the chaos and for any future worldwide pandemics. He picked up the napkin by his plate. It was cloth and of good quality, if a little worn out. After wiping his fingers, he continued. He wanted to be an emperor of sorts, positioned over rulers of each country. "An emperor over kings scenario," Faith added. Nathan nodded. "It's predicted in the truth tome," Faith said. "And he will get his way temporarily. He doesn't accept that the only one who will ultimately reign over kings will be Prince Adani." "No, he does not. Our parting of ways began after he succumbed to Mendax Nabian's indoctrination of a worldwide religion and Scarlet Babylon's popular 'living for our desires' mantra. He started changing then. Now I hardly recognize him." Faith remained silent. "The wolf-eyed guys, I wonder why they wouldn't be on Eden too." "The wolf-eyed guys, I understand why they wouldn't be on Eden too," Nathan said. "But why didn't we see them in Israel?" The question had been on his mind for some time. "They are there, but they're usually cloaked," Faith said. "Cloaked?" Like wolves in sheep's clothing. I think they're revealing themselves because of you. Me? Think of who you are, the twin brother of the betrothed of Prince Adani. You're also the best bargaining chip the world envoy has to gain control of your sister. They don't just reveal themselves to anyone, they know who you are. How? Their master is to save the world envoy's bodyguard. What? It blew his mind, but yet it explained so much. So will he know where I am? She smiled reassuringly. No. Judah told me they've been blocked from communicating your whereabouts. By whom? Who else? The sovereign emperor's command to shut their mouths. Nathan breathed a sigh of relief. He can do that, can't he? What can he not do, Nathan? Okay, that's the end of 28, and I hope you join me next time for chapter 29. Take good care.